Hello and welcome to a new term of the online spatial and urban seminar. Today, we're pleased to have Andrii Parkhomenko from the University of Southern California presenting his paper titled Dynamic Urban Economics.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Augusto, for the introduction. First of all, thanks.
Sorry, I need to say
Sorry.
a couple of more logistical things. Sorry, Andrii, for interrupting. Let me first also say that this is co-author work with Brian Greene and Stein von Nuremberg. Brian is in the audience, and we're also very happy to have David Nagy and Tuli Van Hapelko as our panelists today. And then before handing it off, let me just remind everyone that the seminar is 75 minutes long, with approximately 60 minutes for the presentation, including questions, and then 15 minutes for discussion and further questions. And Andrii has agreed to having questions asked also throughout the talk. All audience members will be muted during the seminar, and to ask a question, please submit it to the Q&A box. And as attendee, you can also upvote those questions that you think are most important. If you have a clarifying question instead of a substantive one, please write clarifying before your question, and we will be monitoring the Q&A box throughout the talk and occasionally unmute those who ask substantive questions so that they may relay them directly to Andrii. With that being said, I'm really glad to hand it off to Andrii. Andrii, the floor is yours.
Okay, very good. Thanks again for the introduction, and thanks for having this paper on the program that is joined with Brian Greene and Stein van Nieuwenburg. So the motivation for this paper comes from the fact that a lot of shocks and policies, especially those that we study in urban economics, they have highly localized effects. And to study those types of shocks and policies, I think a lot of us will agree that we need a model with rich geography. And this is because if you think about a policy like transit improvements, for example, locations that are next to transit stations will be affected by a lot. Locations elsewhere will be affected less. And there may be spatial spillovers from one location to another when it comes to evaluating shocks and policies. You can think about housing or land use types of policies. They will also have very unevenly distributed effects across space. But what we also argue in this paper is that not only you need to incorporate rich geography, you also need to think carefully about dynamics. And this is because agents in those types of models, or in general in such economic environments, such as households and firms, they make location choices in a forward-looking way. When I choose where to live, not only I care about how the location is now, I care about the evolution of the location where I live and other locations in the future. So I need to be able to think about that. Another reason why dynamics is important is because the kinds of choices households and firms make, they are costly, right? And if you are paying this cost, if you are paying the cost of, say, moving to a given neighborhood, you will not move out of there in the next few years, right? Because you already paid the cost, and you need to be able to think about the future. So the current state of the art in urban economics, as many of you know, is the quantitative spatial model, QSM for short. And those are beautiful models with lots of locations, very rich interactions between locations, very flexible. They can model real cities pretty well. However, those models typically abstract from dynamics. On the other side of the spectrum, we think that to understand a lot of dynamic features that are important for evaluating shocks and policies such as transit or zoning and others, there are dynamic macro housing models which have very well model dynamics, but though those models usually abstract from space, or even if they have geography, the geography is very limited, say 2 locations. And in this paper, we will try to bring the 2 approaches together and see what we can learn from them. So from the urban framework, we will have a large number of locations. Each of them will have a separate labor market and real estate market. And real estate markets can be commercial or residential. We'll have commuting across locations, and commuting will be a central force that shapes the city as a single labor market because people don't like commuting a long time. There will be costly migration. If you want to move to a different location, you have to pay the cost. So that's what is typical in spatial models. From the macro housing framework, we will take a life cycle structure. We will have uninsurable income risk. We will also let people make tenure choice, that is the choice to rent or own housing, and there will be collateral constraints and housing transaction costs. And it seems like this is a desirable model to do a careful evaluation of spatial policies. The problem is that this model presents a sizable computational challenge, right? Because as I will show you in more detail, the state space will be very large that is coming from all these model components, and it will be very difficult to solve this model. So the first contribution of this paper will be to show how you can have all these model components and still compute the model very fast using recent advances from macroeconomics and urban economics. The second contribution of the paper will be to show why it matters to introduce dynamics and homeownership. And to do that, we will calibrate the model to the San Francisco Bay Area, and we will run contrafactual policies that are typical for QSMs. There were lots of QSMs written about transportation policies, so we'll do a transportation contrafactual, and we will also do a land use contrafactual. And then we will highlight why it is important to have dynamics and what you cannot learn without having a dynamic model. One thing we'll be able to do is to look at transitional dynamics, and we will show how short run may be different from a long run, and how sometimes transitions may be non-monotonic, that is, you can actually extrapolate short run and learn something about the long run. We will highlight the role of risk and intertemporal choices that households make. And the dynamic structure of the model will allow us to have rich agent heterogeneity and look very carefully at individual welfare effects. But it's not only dynamics that matter. What we'll also show is that even if you have a dynamic model, but you don't have homeownership, then what you can learn about policies in terms of welfare gains may be quite different. And this is because an owner-occupied house is spatially undiversified asset. So when people own housing, they own housing in a given location, and if this location is hit by a shock, their asset will change its value by a lot potentially. And this lack of diversification will lead to much richer distribution of welfare gains as opposed to even a dynamic model, but without homeownership. And we will show some examples how some policies that we studied before in urban literature that seemingly improve average welfare can lead to a lot of losses for many people. And you can connect it to a political economy potentially and think about why some policies that look good on paper for an average agent in terms of welfare do not get implemented in practice. Let me say a few words about the literature. So as I said, we are trying to connect the quantitative spatial frameworks with the macro housing frameworks, and these are the papers that are highly related to what we do. We are not the first to bring dynamics into spatial models. There have been quite a few papers trying to do that. A lot of this work, though, makes certain assumptions to make computation more tractable. There are lots of papers that don't allow saving and borrowing. There are papers such as Bilan and Rossi-Hansberg that model costless migration, in which case the location of residence is not a state variable, which speeds up computation. There's also a strand of literature which divides agents into people who cannot save and borrow, but they can move, or those who can save and borrow but cannot move. More related to what we do is the literature in this bullet point here. So these are the papers that allow forward-looking investment in housing or in human capital, as in Levi Cruz job market paper, and they do allow costly migration. They have home ownership, but they are limited in the number of locations that they can have. Also related to what we do are these two papers with internal city structure, Takeda and Yamagishi and Warnes, and they do have a structure in which people can commute within locations within city, unlike previous papers that I mentioned here. But they also work with hand-to-mouth agents who cannot save and borrow and who don't own housing. Okay, let me know if there are any questions at this point. Okay, no questions. Very good. So let me give you an overview of the model. I'm not going to be able to talk about all the details. The paper is available online, so you can go and check if you are curious about a particular piece of the model, or you can ask a question, of course. So time in our framework will be continuous. And I will spend some time in a couple of slides talking about time in more detail, because this will be central to our computational approach. We will model a closed city, that is, people cannot move or in or out of the city, and there will be a fixed population. There will be potentially many neighborhoods in the city. People live in one neighborhood and work usually in some other neighborhood, J. And as in your typical QSM, locations will be characterized by a few items. They will have their own labor market productivity, Z. They will have residence and workplace amenities, ER and EW, and these will be structural residuals that we will use to fit the model to the data. Then endogenously, in every location, there will be some amount of people who live there and some amount of people who work there. There will also be endogenous supply of residential and commercial floor space, H. There will be endogenous wages. And what is crucial here, what dynamics allow us to do, is we are able to separate prices from rents. And on the transition path, after a shock happens, price-rent ratios will differ a lot by location. So households live for a finite period of for a finite amount of time, and the first stage of their life is the working stage. Then they are retired, and they deterministically die at age capital A. So let me now talk about timing. As I said, timing is continuous, but then there are these discrete points in time which are special. We call them shock ages, and in the quantitative model, they will happen once a year. So think about this as your birthday. You wake up on your birthday, and it's a special day when some things are allowed to happen that don't happen after that. So what happens at shock ages? At shock ages, you wake up and you receive a labor productivity shock. This labor productivity shock will follow AR1 process. And this will partly determine how much income you can make in the next year. After that, you receive a residence preference shock, and you choose where to live. Then you choose whether to rent or own a house. And if you decided to own, you choose the size of the owner-occupied house. And after that, you draw the preference for the workplace, and you choose where to work. So think about this shock age as, big things happen and people make big decisions. But then after the shock age, time continues flowing, and between shock ages, agents make simple consumption and saving decisions. Okay, so they choose how much to consume, how much to save, and when they choose how much to consume, they split between the consumption of the traded good and the rental housing. And this is what a typical dynamic macro model does. Okay, so there's a evolution of consumption saving choices over time, and people want to smooth their consumption and save in a certain way. Very importantly, so consumption and saving choices happen all the time except at shock ages. So we are basically separating these two types of choices in time. And I will later tell you how it helps us with computation. Okay, so let me give you a few more details about households.
Andrii?
Yes.
A quick question. Are the residence preference shocks also serially correlated?
So the preference shocks are IID, but because you have a moving cost, you can think about this. This is going to be isomorphic to a distribution of shocks in which you are likely to get a very high shock for your current location and low shocks for other locations.
Thank you.
I have a question to Andrii.
Go ahead.
Please, David.
Sorry, Olivia. Go ahead if you want.
No, please, David.
Okay, yeah, it's going to be a quick one. You mentioned that there is no consumption savings choice at the shock age, but I guess that's a continuous time choice. So in some sense, it doesn't even matter, no, because that's just a zero measure set.
That's correct. Yes.
the shock ages. So it doesn't matter whether there is a consumption savings choice there or not, or am I getting this right?
Yeah, that's totally correct. It's just that we want to emphasize this because when we have the value function defined at shock ages, we don't want this value function to include a choice of how much to consume and how much to save.
Okay, but immediately afterwards, I can adjust my consumption and savings, which
Exactly.
practically will mean the same for my lifetime utility, I guess.
Yes.
Okay.
And my question that I think is also going to be short, how important, and I guess it's also related to the question on the chat. So how important is the order of the shocks at the like birthday dates? The fact that first is the productivity, then the resident preference, and then the other ones?
So it is very so the order is important here, and it's especially important to have the workplace shock and the choice of workplace the last, because this will allow us to represent the workplace state variable using the wage grid. I'll tell you a bit more details about that later. So we need to have this particular order for computational reasons.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, very good. So let me tell you a few more details about households. The flow utility is CRRA. So people are risk averse, they will try to smooth consumption, and is CRRA in the Cobb-Douglas composite of non-housing C and housing H. And H can be consumed either by owning or renting, and if you own, you have slightly more utility. There is a bequest motif at the end of the life cycle, and we need that to make sure that there is substantial amount of home ownership at the end of the life cycle, as it is in the data. Earnings will depend on how old you are. There is a life cycle component of earnings, individual productivity zeta, which follows AR1 process, and also on where you work. Okay, so it's a combination of how skilled you are and where you work. And retirees will earn a pension after they retire. Then, as I already mentioned, residence and workplace choices will be happening every shock age, and they will depend on fundamentals, amenities, wages, and housing costs, extreme value type 1 shocks, and commuting costs. This is exactly as it is in QSMs. And if someone wants to move across residence locations, they will have to pay a moving cost. There will be an increasing function of age, and this will allow us to match the decrease in migration rates over age. Moving jobs, however, is costless. Okay, then people can save and borrow, and they do it at the exogenous interest rate Q. If someone wants to buy a house, then they will have to save up money for down payment first, and then they will be able to borrow against the value of their house. So this is very standard in those macro housing types of models. And importantly for us, there will be a housing transaction cost. So if you want to either sell your house and move to a bigger house, or you want to become a renter, you have to pay a 6% transaction cost. And this will be an extra friction that will be important for spatial transitions that we'll have. Okay, so let me tell you a few words about the household problem. The state space is described by 6 state variables. And those in red are those that are common in macro housing models. Those in blue are those that come from urban models. So you have liquid wealth B, you have the size of the owner-occupied house H, zeta is individual productivity, and A is H. Okay, and then from the geography part, we have I, the location of residence, and J, the location of workplace. And having these 2 locations enter the state space is what makes computation of a model of internal city structure more difficult than computing a model of the system of cities, in which case everybody lives and works in the same location. Okay, we have several value functions that are defined at every stage of the choice, and I'm not going to show you all of them, but they are all in the paper if you're curious. For example, this is the value function before you receive the workplace preference shock, and I just wanted to show it because you can see that it takes the standard logit form as is very common in spatial models. And it has a closed form, which is great for us because we will be able to use this property and speed up computation. Between shock ages, so this may be something less familiar to some of you. We have a continuous time analog of the Bellman equation. It's called Hamilton-Jacobi Bellman equation. And because remember that between shock ages, you don't make these big decisions. You don't choose where to live. You don't choose where to work. There are no shocks happening. The only thing that you do is choose how much to consume and how much to save. And therefore, the choices between shock ages are described by this relatively simple differential equation that depends on your flow utility and the terms that describe your saving behavior and the passage of age and calendar time. Okay, so
Andrii,
please tell
another
me.
question. This needs to be differentiable at any point except for the shock ages, right? That's the assumption.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, the value function can jump at shock ages, but it has to be continuously differentiable between.
Andrii, and can I ask about the pension? Because I imagine that if the pension depended on the path of wages, then you would have to carry that. So is it just going to be a function of your last wage?
No, yeah, the pension is just going to be the fixed amount. So you can, it doesn't depend on your productivity, but you can also eat your savings. So people will save, and if you want to have higher than that, you'll be able to consume your savings.
Okay.
Okay, so the rest of the model is a bit more standard. We have a production function for the consumption/investment good. So this is the traded good that people consume, and this good is produced using labor L and commercial floor space H. And not only this good will be consumed, it can also be used as an input in the production of floor space. Okay, so floor space is going to be produced using this this good input, and the productivity of real estate developers Z will be modeled such as it can represent realistic supply elasticities that we observe in the data. So this will be an important part of the model because when shocks affect different locations differently, how much housing supply reacts to those shocks will depend on the supply elasticity. Another important feature of our model is that housing is durable. So if a location is hit by a negative shock, you may still have housing left there. There may be excess supply of housing. And this will lead to excess depreciation of house values and may potentially lead to a propagation of to a large propagation of negative shocks and large negative effects on neighborhoods. Okay, so some housing is going to be owner occupied, but then some housing is rental and also commercial real estate is rental. And rental floor space will be owned by real estate investment trusts. And they, in equilibrium, will be indifferent between renting out the property or selling them to owner occupiers. And this indifference will define the no arbitrage condition, which allows us to pin down price rent ratios. And from this equation, if P dot, so P dot is the derivative of prices with respect to time. If we are in the steady state, prices don't change. And we have a simple expression for price rent ratios, which depends on the interest rate Q, depreciation rate delta, and property tax tau. However, if we are away from the steady state, if we are undergoing a transition in response to a shock, then price rent ratios can differ across locations. Okay, so to close the model, the equilibrium in this model will be the value function, the density of state variables, wages, rents, and prices, such that households make optimal decisions. The density of state variables is consistent with those decisions. Firms make optimal choices, and all markets clear. So I'm ready to jump to the computational part, but let me know if there are any questions about the model.
I have a quick question, Andrii. So the concept of equilibrium I should have is one in which there's no aggregate uncertainty.
Yes, we don't have aggregate uncertainty so far. We will study one-time shocks and how the economy responds to that shock.
Thanks.
There is a question from Yanis.
Let me unmute Yanis one second. Yanis, you should be able to talk now.
Thank you. What happens to the portfolios at adjustment times?
So at adjustment times, okay, so let me give you a two-step answer. Between shock ages, you can only adjust your liquid wealth. But at shock ages, you can also adjust your holdings of residential real estate, basically how much housing you own. Then there is also REIT in the portfolio, and REITs in the steady state they make zero profits. They're perfectly competitive, but on the transition path, there may be extra profits generated from appreciation of real estate, and this will be partly redistributed to everybody in the economy. Does that answer your question?
Well, yes, it does. But what patterns of correlations are there across these different assets? Do you allow for any?
Yeah, I mean, people are free to choose whatever asset holdings they have, subject to borrowing constraints and collateral constraints. And we will find that people who tend to have larger financial wealth will also have larger housing wealth, right? Partly because you want to save if you want to buy a house, partly because even if you have a house, you still want to have some liquid wealth for consumption smoothing purposes.
So all that is in the model, yes.
All of that is in the model, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, let me now talk about computation. So in a typical macro housing model, you have 4 state variables: liquid wealth, size of the owner-occupied house, individual productivity, and age. And some macro housing models have a bit more than that. But those models are not trivial to compute. And we are adding to that state space two state variables that represent locations: the location of residence, the location of work. And even in a city with 50 locations, and a lot of you have been working with QSMs with hundreds or thousands of locations. But even if you had 50, you have 2,500 location pairs, okay? And you can imagine how even for a not very rich geography, the state space becomes humongous. And you have to think about wealth, housing, productivity, age distribution in every possible commuting pair. Okay, so this is something that is quite challenging when we want to solve the model on the computer. And it becomes even more challenging if you want to do transitions, right? Because we have to do this separately for every time period on that transition path. So that's challenge number one for us: large state space. Another challenge is that in a spatial model, you have a lot of locations. There are lots of location-specific parameters, and there are hundreds of parameters to estimate, meaning that you have to run this model many, many times before you are able to estimate those parameters. On top of that, we have housing frictions, and household problem is non-convex, meaning that the value function is not continuously differentiable, and we cannot use some of the methods that can speed up computation with differentiable value functions, such as the endogenous grid point method or the master equation approach. So what do? We are building on Brian's job market paper, where he introduced a structure which we are calling mixed time, because it's a combination of discrete and continuous time. And the idea of this method, and this is something I already showed you when I presented the model, is to separate the timing of choices that are discrete in nature, such as location and tenure choices, and compute them using well-established discrete choice methods. And then we separate from that the timing of continuous types of choices, such as consumption and saving. And we model them using continuous time techniques that were recently developed by Ajdu, Han, Lasserie, Lyons, and Moll. Okay, so that's number one. And I strongly encourage you, if you are curious about continuous time, they have a very nice illustration of how much faster it is to solve heterogeneous agent dynamic models and why continuous time is so advantageous. But if you have any questions about continuous time, I'm happy to answer. So solution number 2 that we use is, yes, on the one hand, we have 2 locations enter the state space. And so in principle, as I showed you previously, when you are increasing the size of, when you're increasing the number of locations, the size of the state space should increase quadratically. But we do the following. So we replace the workplace state J with wage. And the reason why we can do that is that after you made all these choices at shock ages, and before you made the location choice of where to work, the only aspect of the location of work that matters is how much money you make there. Okay, and so this allows us to replace the large state variable that represents workplace locations with a relatively small grid of wages. And importantly, even when we increase the number of locations in the model, we can keep the same number of grid points that represents the wage distribution across space. Let me show you how our model performs. So these are computational times to solve the model to solve the steady state of the model. In the paper, we also report computational times for estimating the model, running transitions, etc. So a relatively small city such as Portland that has 18 locations and more than 300 location pairs, we can solve it in less than 8 seconds. In the next part of the paper, we will be running quantitative exercises with a model of San Francisco that has 55 locations and slightly more than 3,000 locations. We can solve it in 20 seconds on a laptop, so you don't need special computing equipment to solve the steady state of the model. And you can see that because we are able to replace the workplace state variable with the wage grid, our computational time increases much less than quadratically. There is some nonlinear increase here, but it is much less than quadratic. And you can handle big cities with hundreds of locations, such as New York, in a very reasonable time. Okay, so now let me go into application, but let me know if there are any questions at this point. Okay, fantastic. So what do we do next? So we have this big model. We have a method to solve it fast. And now we want to show why this matters. Why do you want to do dynamics and home ownership in a spatial model? So what we'll do is we'll calibrate our model to the San Francisco Bay Area. There will be 55 locations, and this is the geography that we will study. For those of you who are familiar with the geography of the Bay Area, this is downtown San Francisco. This is Silicon Valley. So think about our locations as neighborhoods broadly defined. Okay, so we will calibrate the model to 2012, 2016, because this is the most recent period before the pandemic for which we have all the data we need. We borrow a lot of data from my work with Matt Delventhal, where we constructed a big data set of different economic variables at a fine geographical scale. And we calibrate a lot of parameters internally. We match quite well a lot of untargeted moments. I'm happy to show you those if there are any questions, but in the interest of time, I'm going to go into counterfactuals. Okay, so what do we do now? We will run 2 counterfactuals that are quite typical of what QSMs do. One of the counterfactuals will involve deregulation of land use or upzoning, and the idea will be to allow more housing construction in an area. Another counterfactual will be to do a transportation improvement. And then we will try and compare how our results are different from what a static model could achieve. And so let me start with the first one. As you may know, a lot of big American and not only American cities experience problems with housing supply. And one of the reasons is restrictive land use regulations. And what we will do is we will increase the productivity of developers in some locations. So in particular, we will increase productivity by 10% towards the median in locations with below the median productivity. And you can interpret that as relaxing land use regulations, reducing single-family zoning. So it's going to be a pretty stylized way to do that, but we are trying to represent policies that allow for more housing supply. Don't think about this as a specific policy that exists or was proposed. The idea here is not to study a specific policy. The idea is to show what our model predicts for the types of policies that others have studied using those kinds of frameworks in a static way. Okay, so this is where housing productivity increases in our model. Most of the increases happen in Silicon Valley and downtown San Francisco, the usual suspects where prices are extremely high and housing supply is extremely constrained. And what we see in the long run in response to these policies is that residents move to those areas and jobs also move to those areas to be closer to where workers are. But this is something that you don't need our model for. This is something that you can learn from a static model as well. What you won't be able to learn from a static model is the following. So we are able to map the entire transitional path of how residents and jobs relocate in every given location. And what you see is that, yes, in the long run, there is a sizable relocation of residents and jobs to treated locations, though there's a lot of heterogeneity. But this happens quite slowly. If you're a policymaker and you want to propose a zoning policy, and you want to think about what will happen before the next election is coming up, say in 3 years, there isn't much happening in the first 3 years, okay? And that's because moving costs are high, that's because housing transaction costs are high, and people will only gradually respond to those changes in policies.
What do we see on the vertical axis here, Andrii?
On the vertical axis, this is the percentage change in the number of residents in each location.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, so our dynamic model also allows us to study housing markets much more carefully. And what we see here is that if you look at rents first, you see that there is a huge drop in rents in many treated locations. That's because you have this very short run increase in housing supply. But then rents go up and almost recover in the future. And that's because people move in to those areas to take advantage of lower rents. Prices, however, don't drop as much, and that's because prices are forward-looking. Real estate investors know that in the future, there will be more demand for living in those locations, and therefore prices, as incorporating future increases in rents, will go down by only a little. And this will imply large differences in price and ratios across locations. And this will have large implications for who is able to own a house and who can rent a house in every given location. And this will affect welfare by a lot. Before I talk about
Andrii?
welfare, yes.
A quick question about the calibration of the initial equilibrium. What in the model explains the price rent ratios that you observe in the cross section of the data?
Okay, very good question. In our model, let me just scroll back and show you the equation. The price rent ratio in the steady state, in which case P dot is equal to 0, is going to be 1 over the sum of the interest rate, the depreciation rate, and the property tax. So this is a standard asset pricing equation. Importantly, none of these items are location specific, so we'll have the same price rent ratio in every neighborhood. You can also, if you want to make it more realistic, you can look at price rent ratios at every neighborhood and add a neighborhood-specific wedge to represent those differences. We don't do that. But nonetheless, without assuming any location-specific exogenous characteristics of price and ratios, we are able to obtain those differences across locations on the transition path. Okay, so let me show you the second experiment that we do. Many of you might have heard about high-speed rail in California. May not happen anytime soon or maybe never, but nonetheless, we will imagine that California is able to build high-speed rail successfulully. Not only that, we will also imagine that people use it for commuting. Okay, so we'll have 4 stations in the San Francisco Bay Area: San Francisco, Millbrae, SFO, San Jose, and Gilroy. And this will be a new transportation mode that people will be able to use to commute to work. Okay. Again, don't judge me on how realistic this is. The purpose is not to evaluate high-speed rail. The purpose is to show what our model predicts if you do this type of a counterfactual, which is a very standard counterfactual that people do using static QSMs. Okay, so we recalculate the commuting metrics in our model, and people see a reduction in commuting times, especially in locations with stations and locations close to stations. And then we, again, look at the long run change in the number of residents and jobs in every location. And people tend to move to places with stations and adjacent locations. Jobs, not necessarily so. So jobs sometimes move out of locations with stations, and that's because people who used to, I'll tell you more about this in a second because this will be an interesting case. But you see some reallocation of residents and jobs. And again, that's something you would be able to obtain from a static model by just comparing two steady states. What you wouldn't be able to do, again, is to look at transitions. There is a gradual relocation of residents and jobs across space. And what I want to highlight here is that sometimes these transitions can be non-monotonic. Look at the change in jobs in the location called Gilroy. So on impact, and Gilroy, by the way, is this location at the corner of the metropolitan area. It's relatively remote, it's relatively unproductive. And what happens there is on impact, the location loses about 3% of jobs. And this happens because people who used to work there, they tended to live there as well because this location is poorly connected to the rest of the Bay Area. Now they have an option to take high-speed rail and work in more productive locations elsewhere in the Bay Area. And they take this opportunity. But then over time, as more people move to live in that location, some of them will take local jobs. And local jobs will partly recover, right? So you have a much smaller negative effect on jobs in the long run than you have in the short run. Again, you have some interesting effects on prices and rents. Rents go up in treated locations with stations. Prices jump immediately on impact because they foresee this future evolution of rents. Let me talk about welfare now.
Sorry, Andrii,
So-
before you get
yes.
to welfare, can I ask about the homeownership rate?
Yes, please do.
So I'm just curious about how does it adjust? Because I guess for bigger houses in your calibration of the model, bigger units have to be owner occupied, right? And so then it's only the smaller units where homeownership rates can adjust. Am I correct?
Yeah, okay. So we have a distribution of house sizes, and there is some overlap between rental and owner-occupied, but rental units cannot be too large, and owner-occupied units cannot be too small. That's correct.
Right. So do you know if it's coming more through like more construction of, for example, if homeownership increases, is it coming through more construction of smaller units, or is it coming from the existing units shifting from the landlords to the homeowners?
So it is definitely both, but we need to check how much it is of each channel. So I don't have an immediate answer to you.
Thanks.
Okay. Let's talk about welfare now. So we measure welfare gains in a consumption equivalent way, and we look at welfare gains in each counterfactual, both taking into account the transition and just comparing two steady states as you would do in a static QSM. And in the high-speed rail counterfactual, the difference is very small between the two. In the upzoning counterfactual, however, you will overestimate welfare gains by more than 1/2 if you don't take into account the transition. And this is because on impact in this upzoning counterfactual, a lot of homeowners lose welfare, right? Because house values go down. What we're also able to do, given that our model is dynamic, is we can look at welfare gains in very
Andrii?
different. Yes.
Sorry, what is the risk aversion parameter that you use? Just to get a sense of.
Yeah, we use a parameter. We use a value of 2.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so now we can also look at welfare gains along different dimensions, because our dynamic structure allows us to have a lot of heterogeneity across agents. So we can look at welfare gains by age separately for owners and renters. What we find is that young owners actually like the upzoning policy, even though house values go down. And this is because even though they lose the value of their house a little bit, they can buy a bigger house in the future. But older owners don't really like the policy, especially the oldest ones, because they have a huge hit to their wealth, and they prefer the policy not to happen. Renters like this policy because it increases the stock of housing supply. We can also look at the welfare gains by wealth. And what happens is that now pretty much all the renters like the policy. What is more interesting is what happens to owners. So owners who are the least happy about increasing housing supply are the least wealthy owners. This is because they have very little wealth. They probably just bought a house. They are very leveraged. And then the government comes in and announces a policy that will deteriorate their wealth. So they obviously don't like it very much. But wealthy owners also don't like it. And that's because they tend to have bigger houses, and any effect on housing values will have a relatively more effect on them. In the high-speed rail counterfactual, owners tend to win more than renters, and especially owners close to stations. So welfare gains become smaller and smaller as you move out farther from the train stations. And younger owners tend to benefit more. Okay, that's because they have more of a lifetime to enjoy high-speed rail. Old owners also win a lot because they are unlikely to move anywhere else because moving costs are higher with age, and because housing wealth is very important for them since they don't earn any labor income anymore. Okay, and you have a similar effects for wealth. So it is the least wealthy and the most wealthy owners who benefit the most from high-speed rail. Okay, so let me now try and convince you that you need to have dynamics and you need to have home ownership to evaluate spatial effects of the types of policies that we usually study in urban economics.
Andrii,
Was there a
sorry,
question?
before
Yes.
we move, yes, Chris, you should be allowed to talk.
Well, sorry, it was maybe a quibbling point, but the welfare calculation by age, this is driven by a bequest motive. I guess I'm wondering, does it implicitly assume that there are out-of-town children only? Or is that nest my children's home buying ability? It seems like
Yeah,
if my kids lived in the same town, then I would start to include their ability to buy a cheaper home also in my welfare analysis.
Yeah, this is definitely what's important in practice. In the model, we don't model that explicitly. People just have a bequest motive for reasons we don't explain. But implicitly, it can be what you're explaining, that you want to basically build a better future for your kids.
Sorry for the distraction.
And then,
Okay.
Giorgio, do you have a question too?
No, it was answered in the conversation.
Right.
Okay, very good. Let me now move on to the last part of the presentation. I'll show you a few more figures trying to convince you that you really need to have dynamics and home ownership. Okay, so speaking of dynamics, I showed you a few results that we think are important that you cannot really obtain in a static model. First, transitional dynamics. You can look at short and long run separately. In fact, you can look at any time horizon that you want to look at. If you have a politician who wants to know what will happen in 2 years, that's something our model can speak to. And what's important is that sometimes transitions can be non-monotonic. So you really need to have dynamics. You cannot really approximate it with some a sequence of static models with some sort of adjustment. And we are also able to talk about differences in prices and rents, and this is important for welfare. There is a large role of risk in intertemporal choices. These are intertwined with location choices, and dynamics allow us to have rich heterogeneity and therefore rich distribution of welfare gains. Okay, so I hope I was able to at least partly convince you of that. But now the next question is, okay, you may have dynamics, and there are quite a few papers in the literature that I mentioned before. They do have dynamics in spatial models with hand-to-mouth agents who don't save and borrow and who don't own any property. Why go all the way and model saving and borrowing behavior and model home ownership? So to answer that question, we will build and calibrate an alternative model, which is pretty much the same as our main model, except that people are not allowed to buy houses. So everybody is a renter. And there is some sense in which house values matter, because residents will own shares in REITs. And even if they don't own housing directly, indirectly, changes in house values will affect their portfolio. So what happens in that kind of model relative to our main model? Average welfare gains, which you see in line 1, in both counterfactuals are not that different. I mean, they are different, but that's not what makes introduction of homeownership important. What makes it important is that you have much greater variation of welfare gains. So variance of welfare gains is much larger in our main model as opposed to the model without homeownership in both counterfactuals. And even though both upzoning and high-speed rail policies are welfare improving for an average resident, there are lots of losers in those policies. So for example, in the upzoning policy, more than 1/3 of residents lose in our main model, as opposed to just 4% in the model without homeownership. In the HSR policy, 22% lose in our model, as opposed to 13% in the model without homeownership. And where these losses are concentrated has also very interesting geographical patterns. So in this map, I'm showing you the fraction of residents who are harmed by the upzoning policy. So basically those who experience welfare losses. And in our main model, you see that in pretty much every location, there is a substantial number of losers. And in some locations, so these are red bars here, the number of losers is more than 50%. So basically the median voter loses from this kind of policy. In a model without homeownership, everything is nice. There are very few people who lose, okay? And that's, and again, this is not because the effect on real estate value is not incorporated. This is because everybody's real estate ownership is diversified and people are not leveraged. Now, let me show you separately homeowners in our main model. So here we do the same, only looking at the welfare of owners in our main model. And what you see here is that in all but 5 locations in the San Francisco Bay Area, the majority of owners lose from the policy. And you can imagine in a political economy framework, I mean, we know in the data that owners are much more politically active. They tend to vote more. You can imagine how a policy such as what we do in this exercise, even though it's great for the average household in the San Francisco Bay Area, it will never be voted for because the majority of homeowners don't like the policy. We can do the same kind of exercise for high-speed rail. In our main model, there are quite a few losers, and interestingly, they tend to be away from where high-speed rail stations are. And that's because locations away from high-speed rail experience population outflows, and owners in those locations don't like the fact that this leads to a deterioration of their house values. In the no home ownership model, losses tend to be concentrated next to high-speed rail stations. Okay, so there is a negative correlation in terms of where losers are in our model, as opposed to a more standard model without homeownership. And again, we can look at homeowners separately. And what's interesting is that there are quite a few locations in which more than 50% of owners lose from the construction of high-speed rail. And interestingly, there are lots of losers in places between the stations right here, okay? And this is because these locations are very close to where the stations are, and a lot of economic activity will move away from those locations into the neighborhoods with stations. But the fact that they're very close suggests that, again, there may be an interesting political economy situation, because these locations don't directly benefit from high-speed rail, but the tracks will have to go through them. And they will have a lot of political power to say whether high-speed rail can be built or not, and can potentially overturn the construction of this policy. Again, you have an example of a policy that is great for an average household, but creates substantial amount of losers in key locations, such that in a political equilibrium, this policy may never happen. Okay.
Sorry, can I ask?
What
Yes.
time horizon is this?
Oh no,
Oh, sorry.
there you go, Erika. Go.
Yeah, just what time horizon are we looking at these welfare effects at? Is
Okay,
this
so-
like the new steady state, or is this somewhere on the transition?
So this is we are looking at time 0, just after shock happened, and this is discounted. This is a discounted measure. So this is taken into account the transition that will happen afterwards.
Awesome, thanks.
So on very similar line, like something like a clarifying question, I guess I have with respect to these maps is that, are we looking at how people perceive a potential policy in the future? So is the distribution of residents the one before policy? Because if you allow people to move, then it's not obvious, right? Who are you? What is the fraction of residents? Is the fraction of residents before or after the?
It is before. So basically, everybody wakes up where they are currently, and this policy is announced, and they know how this policy will affect their future. I'm going to evaluate how they feel about this policy, if you will.
All right. Yeah.
And of
no,
course,
that's great.
after
Thanks.
people move around, the distribution of welfare gains may be different. Okay, and very, very importantly, so we have this welfare patterns with a lot of losers, because owner-occupied house is a spatially undiversified asset. Very often people own housing with a lot of leverage, and even small changes to house values may lead to large changes in welfare. Okay, I think I'm ready to conclude. So in this paper, we offer a dynamic urban model that blends key features of state-of-the-art QSMs, state-of-the-art static QSMs, and also key features of dynamic macro-housing models. So we have a lot of locations, commuting, migration, forward-looking households, tenure choice, frictions, risk, etc. And even though this model has a huge state space and is difficult to compute, we are bringing in the so-called mixed time approach, which combines continuous and discrete time methods. And this allows us to study cities with a lot of locations in a pretty computationally efficient way. We argue that a lot of important results that we find cannot be obtained from traditional models without dynamics, and models with dynamics, but without a large number of locations. And it is key to add homeownership here, because homeownership results in a very different welfare effects for especially heterogeneous shocks and policies, and allows us to look more carefully at the distribution of welfare gains across space. And we think that our modeling approach has a large number of potential applications in terms of studying all kinds of shocks and policies that affect cities as well as larger geographies. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrii. That was great. Very good timing, and thank you for a very interesting and fantastic talk. Now we're very excited to turn things over to our panelists, David Nagy and Tuli Panhapelto. Sorry if I butcher your last name, but Tuli, we can start with you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let me quickly share my screen. Oh, Andrii, can you stop sharing your screen so that I can?
Just
Thank
stop.
you. Thank you. All right. So thank you so much to the organizers for having me as a panelist, for the opportunity to discuss this paper. And it has been really a great pleasure. So I think it's after this presentation, it's easy to agree that this is a really impressive project. And I don't think I exaggerate very much if I say that this project and this line of research really has the potential to change the way we will be conducting quantitative spatial economics in the near future. So thank you for that. here is my attempt of trying to summarize the current or the prior state of the urban economics literature in terms of home ownership. So we know that we have a long tradition of dividing these models basically into two building blocks. So we've had households who have made who've been making location choices, sometimes with a really realistic geography and commuting choices. But we've had the second block of the model, something that we call usually absentee landlords, who've been providing rental housing, and all households have often been modeled as renters. This has been fairly rich in the sense that we've even been able to talk about how policy affects house prices with this absentee landlord setup. But the missing part has been some sort of I think we have had a kind of a missing homeowner problem. So we haven't been able to map how house price changes translate to heterogeneity, to differences in homeowner welfare. And as you've just highlighted, this is potentially extremely important for thinking about the welfare, the distributional consequences of policy. So you bring in this homeowner block. This is amazing. You can think about the effects of urban policy on homeowner wealth, household welfare. And this is through the kind of this combination of a modern quantitative model with the macro housing setup. And this allows you to then think about questions like the political economy of urban policy, like the opposition to policies that are on average welfare improving. So this is really, really cool. I have some thoughts on potential things that you might be thinking about either in this paper or potentially for another paper. These results rely on this innovation on mixed time. I think is really impressive. So the idea that time is continuous, but shocks come at discrete points in time. I'm wondering, is it a free lunch? Because the way you frame it, it sounds too good to be true. So what are the costs from implementing this approach? I guess one of them was mentioned during the talk. So there was some discussion around the sequentiality of choices. And for example, you fix your housing, you fix a 10-year choice before knowing where you're going to work. And hence you don't know what your income is when you decide your tenure. But I guess those seem kind of second order. So I couldn't figure out too many costs to this approach. You seem to have all the building blocks of a standard quantitative model. So it doesn't seem to be too costly. I would be curious to hear your thoughts on that. And you already hinted at this, but I guess really, sky is the limit in terms of what can you use this methodology for. Something that did cross my mind is, would it be possible for you to think about incorporating a kind of a rental asset in this model? And now you have this kind of liquid real estate investment trusts. But I think one of the recent findings in the macro housing literature has been that some of the results, especially around how shocks capitalize to house prices or home ownership, really rely on what you assume about the elasticity of rental supply. So whether you're thinking about this kind of, I guess in your setup, you have these very large houses that have to be owner occupied. So there is no rental market available. And then you have these smaller units they exist in both the rental sector and the owner occupied sector, but they're kind of perfectly elastically supplied by the real estate investment trusts. So I guess this could be potentially interesting to think about either in this context or some other one. Nonetheless, I think you are basically providing much better answers to old questions. So this is really impressive. I think this also opens up a lot of new questions around this theme that I think has received very little attention in the literature up until this point, precisely for the reason that we haven't been able to solve these models with a high number of locations. But I'm interested in these questions of how do household consumption savings decisions around home ownership shape cities. So I can think of a number of questions, but for example, you have a model where households like home ownership and households also like less commuting. How do households trade off these choices between commuting and tenure? I guess we don't even know empirically that much around these estimates. I think this matters because this potentially is very important for questions like, are credit constraints pushing young households, for example, to more remote locations while they save up for down payment? Or the reverse could even happen. We have some evidence from the macro housing literature now that more tight credit constraints actually make households just postpone the time at which they start saving. So it's not clear, even theoretically, what should happen. And potentially, I think this is very important. So I'm just pulling here a few graphs from a recent working paper or research paper that's titled "The California's Sliding Homeownership Ladder." And I think it was funny because this is related to your empirical application. But we've seen in the data, at least, that in terms of, for example, age at which households enter homeownership, it has become much harder young households to enter. Potentially, this has also big implications for not only household savings, but also the way cities are structured. So I think this could be potentially interesting for you to think about in this project or another one. Let me stop by saying again, I really think that this is potentially something that, in 5 years, grad students are going to be learning in grad school about how to use mixed time methods. So I think it's overall very impressive. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Tuli. That was a great productive discussion. And David, you can feel free to go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for asking me to discuss this project. I share Tuli's enthusiasm about it. I think it's a fascinating project. And part of it comes from personal bias. Incorporating dynamics in spatial models is obviously close to my heart and perhaps even closer to my past work than to my heart. But I think it's more than that. I think in this paper, the authors build a model that has a fascinatingly large number of dimensions of heterogeneity that is really unprecedented. I can, list the dimensions of heterogeneity. There is residential and workplace choice subject to migration frictions, which implies that location decisions are forward-looking. There's heterogeneity in terms of the efficiency of labor. There is heterogeneity in terms of age of economic agents, tenure decision, and so on and so forth. And of course, handling a model with all this heterogeneity is computationally challenging, but this is where recent advances in computational economics come to help the authors. And, in particular, this mixed time approach that was developed by Brian in his earlier paper is of great help here. And using these computational advances, the authors can solve the model, which allows them to quantify the benefits and potential losses from land use regulation or from transport infrastructure improvements. I'm going to make a few comments on details of the analysis, and then after that, in the last 1 minute or 2 minutes, I'm going to try to discuss a bit more like the big picture and make suggestions related to the big picture that might actually call for perhaps another paper rather than them being handled in this paper. So regarding the details, one thing that I was a little confused by was how exactly the land use counterfactual is conducted. I understand that this is not meant to replicate or imitate any actual policy change, but nonetheless, I would have expected that what the authors change is not necessarily the productivity of construction at certain locations, but rather the elasticity, right? Which would allow developers to construct in certain places to react to the price of housing to demand basically in certain places more than others. So I'm wondering why the authors decided to change the productivity rather than this kind of elasticity of construction. Then the other thing that I felt was potentially important is some robustness analysis on the model's timing assumptions. In particular, there was this discussion that Andrii had around the end of his talk around the fact that people move to Gilroy because it's now well connected to jobs after high-speed rail is there. And those are jobs in the CBD that is well connected to. But then people end up moving there and end up taking jobs in Gilroy. I'm not sure whether under different assumptions on timing with respect to workplace and residential choice, that would still be a result. But maybe I'm wrong about that. So some robustness perhaps would be good in that regard. And then finally, I was actually surprised that the authors when they make this contrast between static effects versus dynamic effects, the latter coming out of their model. Why is this contrast made with the steady state of the dynamic model as opposed to just simply a static quantitative spatial model in the vein of Alfeld et al. I would wonder what the quantitative effects of, for instance, high-speed rail would be in such a static model. They could actually be different from the steady state of their dynamic model, because even in the steady state of their dynamic model, these decisions are being made, right, in a forward-looking manner. So it's not exactly, I understand that people often make this analogy between steady states of dynamic models and static models. But in this case, I feel like it would be nice to just make the comparison with a truly static model as well. Big picture, again, perhaps for another paper, can we discriminate between static models and dynamic models, or, with models, dynamic models that incorporate more heterogeneity versus dynamic models that incorporate less heterogeneity, or truly forward-looking choices versus not truly looking forward choices, based on how well they can match empirically estimated, well-identified effects. So if there is actually a transport infrastructure improvement and we can measure its effect in the reduced form on various economic outcomes, is there something that the static model really gets wrong in terms of matching those empirical effects that the dynamic model wouldn't? I think that would be very interesting. And then Andrii was kind of getting here in the end of his talk, but it's not done in the paper. Can you perhaps use the model to speak to why land use regulation or transport infrastructure construction take place where they actually take place? Is there something that we can learn about the location of these investments or policy changes that the model teaches us? And I guess, in order to analyze that, we would want to measure how much of an incentive there is for a particular policy change or a particular change in fundamentals according to the model, and how these incentives vary across space. Some kind of analysis of that, I think, would be very interesting. But overall, very interesting project. And again, thanks a lot for asking me to discuss it.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tuli and Davi,
Andrii,
or
you
you
have a few
go ahead.
minutes.
Okay.
Oh, no,
Thanks a lot.
I was just going to say you can go ahead.
Very good. Thanks for your wonderful discussions, and thanks to everyone else for your questions. Let me respond to Tuli first. So what are we losing by using mixed time? So you mentioned the order of choices, and that's something that we could in principle relax, right? We can have a different order of choices, but this will have implications for the computational efficiency. Okay, so we need to have the workplace choice. The last we need to have them in a certain order, and it doesn't really break down the validity of the mixed time approach, but it helps us with computation by a lot. And we also argue. So we have a long discussion in the paper about why our mixed time approach is not necessarily a strong assumption compared to what people do. So if you think about traditional discrete time models, that's what traditional discrete time models assume implicitly by forcing everything to happen in discrete instances. But in those models, there is nothing in between those periods. I also appreciate your comment on the rental elasticity. So right now, except the fact that rental houses can be too small and owner-occupied houses can be too large, except for that, we have perfect segmentation in the housing market, and that's something we can potentially address in the next iteration of the paper. And I really like the comments on the trade-off between commuting and tenure. That's definitely something that happens in our model. We haven't investigated to which extent this is an important force, but truly people want to own houses, and sometimes they will sacrifice longer commuting times to be able to live in an owner-occupied house. To David's points, so we chose to so in the model we have separate terms that represent productivity and elasticity, although the productivity term depends on elasticity, so it's a bit endogenous. But nonetheless, we decided to adjust productivity instead of elasticity. We could do elasticity as well. It's just a bit trickier to do that. I encourage everybody to read Brian's note on why adjusting elasticity is not necessarily the best way to do counterfactuals on land use. So that's what we decided to do.
Andrew, can I add something really quick?
Yeah.
So David, if you just change the elasticity, but don't have any other shock that changes where people want to move, there isn't much of an effect by itself. You kind of need the elasticity to change and like something to make people want to change their location. So it's a little bit simpler just to change the productivity, because now prices go down on impact, and so people want to move. We can certainly change elasticities. Yeah, but the effect is smaller.
Right. So whether changing the timing of choices will overturn the result on Gilroy, I wouldn't know. We have to try, but that's an interesting idea. I also agree that we can use a fully fully static model to compare to our main model. At some point, we were doing that. I guess the exercise that we are doing is, let's try to get as close as possible to our model, but shut down home ownership and see what happens. But I totally agree that that's something that is valuable to do. And it is very interesting. I think our model can speak to that, to think about the political economy of choices about where infrastructure improvements happen, where policy improvement, where housing policy improvements happen. That's totally something that our model can do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrii, for the great talk. Thank you to Brian and Stein for joining us. Thank you, David and Tuli, for the great comments, and all attendees for joining us today. This concludes our first session of the term. The next talk will be on February 21st with Judy Chevalier presenting distributional impacts of the changing retail landscape. I hope to see you